Welcome to a typical day at summer school, the Science Foundation course.
Well, it's just the whole atmosphere here. Everybody around you is either a tutor or a student, and it's a very nice atmosphere. You don't have people at home who think you're a bit silly doing what you do, and everybody is in the same position as you.
Fifth of August, year of our Lord, 1158. I, Frederick, by God's divine grace, Holy Roman Emperor, do declare the following, that henceforth in the lands over which I have sovereignty, all those who study and instruct in established studia genera or institutes of learning shall have the right to dwell in security and pursue the proper study of theology, the arts and the sciences in freedom from unjust arrest.
Science is really a marriage of theory and experiment. Both are equally important. And we find that students get a great deal of practice with theoretical work, with units, but they have to come here, really, to do their experimental work properly under the guidance of tutors and with the help of their student colleagues. And it's here that they really build their confidence in doing experimental work. And that's a very important component of the course.
There are two modes of acquiring knowledge, namely by reasoning and experience. Reasoning draws a conclusion and makes us grant the conclusion, but it does not make the conclusion certain, nor does it remove doubt. Experimental science is, therefore, the mistress of the speculative sciences. It alone is able to give us important truths which the other sciences can learn in no other way.
Well, it's an extremely good example of testing scientific methodology in that the students are presented with a phenomenon, and that is the effect of gamma radiation on wheat seedlings.
Two types of wheat that's been grown from seed, one of which hasn't been treated with gamma radiation and the other hasn't. That was at the seed stage. And they've grown the samples, they've taken them at 3, 7 and 14 days and given us specimens of those. And in particular, in the first part, we examined the 3-day ones, then the 7-day and the 14-day to see the differences between the treated and untreated. And then in particular to try and get more information and see the differences of the days, and then go into it in more detail as to the possible reasons as why one grows more than the other or the reverse.
I shall try to present to your holiness the subject of the attainment of my knowledge, not only relatively, but absolutely as best I can at the present time. We do not perceive the wonderful actions of nature which are done every day in us and in things before our eyes. We think they are done by divine operation, or by angels, or devils, or chance. But this is not so, except insofar as every operation is in some sort from God. And this does not prevent operations being done according to natural laws, for nature is the instrument of God's handiwork.
If you take a suitable coleoptile, first of all find a suitable coleoptile. If you trap this over your nail, I think this is probably the easiest way of doing it, trap it over your nail like that. You'll have to work backwards if you're right-handed, I'm afraid. Trap it over your nail and nick this coleoptile really finely. Now, you've really got to be, you've got to be delicate about this. I don't mean dig into it or slice it, but just make the tiniest of grooves on it. And then, with a pair of forceps, you grab hold of the lifted piece of tissue and pull.
We're trying to get very thin layers off the cortical bit of this plant, so then we can measure the different cells. It's not very difficult, but it's not that easy.
I think the most difficult is the use of the microscope. If you haven't used one before, it's a bit strange. It's not the sort of thing that's in the home experiment kit, obviously. And it takes a while to get used to it. And it's this sort of strain where you're, you know, all the time looking down the tube and you're obviously not used to it. But the rest of it is quite reasonable. It's a bit tricky when you're trying to scrape the outer layers off the leaves and such like. It's something that you don't really meet unless you obviously do it in your own job. But it sort of teaches you practical or laboratory skills. And the more you get into the experiment, you get to the stage where time is not of the essence and you get completely involved in the thing. And you flow along quite nicely. And it's quite a revelation at the end, really.
In fact, science is built on people who said that can't possibly be right. So therefore, it takes 10 years for somebody else to rediscover it.
Now there are 4 chief obstacles in the grasping of truth which hinder every man, however learned, and scarcely allows anyone to win a clear title to learning. Namely, the influence of custom, popular prejudice, concealment of our own ignorance by an ostentatious display of our knowledge, and submission to faulty and unworthy authority. Every man is entangled in these difficulties. Every rank is beset.
This experiment is about an instrument called a spectrometer and how it's used to measure the wavelengths of visible light. And by measuring the wavelengths of visible light, the students can get some information about energy levels in atoms, about the electron energy levels. We thought it would be a good idea to get the students to appreciate what a spectrometer was, to actually get them to build one themselves. And they do this with perhaps some rather unpromising materials, like pieces of cardboard tubing and plasticine and so forth.
We actually had to make one out of some cardboard rolls and toilet rolls and things. But it worked. It was quite remarkable, really. And one of the interesting things about it was that at the end, at the lens end of the spectrometer, there were a set of crosshairs. Well, of course, when we made our own, the only thing we couldn't think of what to use for crosshairs, and we ended up using our own hair.
Oh, you need to put that switch down there.
Yes.
It'll take a few minutes to warm up because it glows red at first. It's got a neon starter in it.
Right, where's the collimator? The
100 lines per millimetre grating. So that's
that one, yeah. That's the
It is easily shown by the rules I have discovered that very large objects can be made to appear very small, and very distant objects to seem very close at hand. For we can so shape transparent bodies and arrange them in such a way that the rays will be bent in any direction we desire. Thus, from an incredible distance, we might read the smallest letters and number grains of sand. In this way, a child might appear a giant, and a man a mountain.
You have actually got this thing the wrong way round. Yes, that's all right. No, the slit, in fact, goes up to the light, and the grating at the other side of the lens. So parallel light comes from the lens.
cut.
yeah.
That's all right. So you want to bring that fairly close up to the light source, you see, so you get plenty of light going through the slit.
If a man looks at letters or other small objects through the medium of a crystal or a glass or of some other transparent body placed above some letters, he will see them much better and they will appear larger to him. Therefore, this instrument is useful to the aged and to those with weak eyes, for they can see letters, no matter how small, sufficiently enlarged.
Can I make another suggestion, and that is that you put the grating actually in the middle of the protractor and this on the other side, okay?
Yes.
So the telescope needs to be on a piece of card which is slipped underneath there. That's right, that's right.
Sure.
I mean, if you stick that on a piece of card, which then is pinned with this same drawing pin, you see what I mean?
Yes.
The whole thing can move around like that.
Yeah, that's fine. Right.
Actually, we want a mark here, don't we, off the card, to say that's our 90. And then it doesn't matter if we turn the protractor as well. We can see how many degrees we've turned it.
That's right. In other words, like this.
As regards Aristotle's statement that there is a difference between the transmission of light and that of other sensory impressions, we must say that many are deceived in this particular. This difference is not to be understood as consisting in the fact that light is transmitted instantaneously and that other impressions require time. Sound consists of the local motions of the particles of the air, none of which motions take place in the multiplication of light. For though we cannot perceive it, light is not an emanation of particles, but a movement propagated through successive parts of the medium.
Spare time? No, not a lot. Everything is quite regimented here. From the minute you get up in the morning, you sort of breakfast and first session in the labs, straight from there to lunch, about half an hour free time, and then it's off back to the labs. And so your day goes on right through to the tutorials in the evening.
Food's quite good, actually. I was a bit dubious about it, you know, with them catering for such large numbers, but I think they've done a reasonable job.
Don't you feel we've been haunted today by this lot over there?
With just these three particles, and of course they're antiparticles, but we'll talk about that in a moment. Now, the first thing that you notice about these three particles is they've got fractional electric charges.
There are no lectures given on experimental science either at Paris or at Oxford, and this is a shameful thing, because authors write many statements, and people believe them through reasoning, which they formulate without experience.
You make it from a quark and an anti-quark.
And we ended up with what we're guessing is chromate.
For example, it is generally believed that diamonds cannot be broken except by goat's blood, and philosophers and theologians use this idea. But fracture by means of blood has never been verified.
And acid plus H plus gives.
And after the tutorials, what happens?
Then you go to the bar, and that's the best bit.
T is telophase. Right. And telophase is when the cell's actually broken apart.
And the cell's divided.
So when does anaphase begin?
When the chromosomes start moving from the equator.
Okay, so the chromosomes split, and that's the beginning of anaphase. Before that, it's interphase still. Yeah. Okay.
Still carrying
on. I don't know. We'll see.
Concerning the pleasure taken in drunkenness and gluttony, Seneca speaks fittingly. Oh, how many things men do when intoxicated, for which they blush when sober. When the power of wine overpowers the mind, every hidden evil comes forth to view. It is then that the lustful brook no delay in their passions. It is then that the unchaste proclaim their disease. It is then that the ill-natured restrain not their tongues, nor their hands.
It seems strange to think that this particular fossil was once alive, and it was such a long time ago, and it seems hard to believe that it was, and that it's still recognisable. You can tell what it came from and who its ancestors are, so to speak.
We know, therefore, that dragons and other marvellous animals that even the ancients have not recorded live in some part of the world. Neither Pliny nor Aristotle makes mention of them, but it is certain that these creatures exist, for their teeth and bones are found in the soil even of our own land.
I think the age of most things is interesting, because in the quarry we went to see, we were told it was 40 million years old, and to stand there and to think in those terms is very difficult, and I find that's very interesting.
This experiment is part of a follow-up from work that we do on Sunday morning in the field. When the students first come to summer school, on Sunday morning they go out in the coaches, the whole summer school, to a quarry not very far from here at Bracknell, where what we try to do is to look at an ancient exposure of sand. It's about 40 million years old, Eocene in age, and we look first of all at the sorts of structures that are preserved in that sand quarry, things like bedding, how the sand layers are laid down, whether they're horizontal, whether they're inclined, the sorts of structures we can see, organic structures, worm burrows, worm tubes, shrimp tubes, and even the composition of the sand as we find it in the field.
Well, first of all, we took samples of sand, and the object was to find out if they had been carried by wind, water, whether that water was beach or river. So by looking at the shape and the texture of the sand particles, you could work this out for yourself.
Now, when we come into the lab here, we do a follow-up exercise in which we're trying to see if we can find whether a sand deposit has some kind of fingerprinting mechanism which we can use to characterise its environmental deposition. So our first aim, if you like, is to see what population of grains is present.
So I should just do it on those first three.
So the object is to use a bank of sieves which are graded in different sizes, getting finer as they go down. And then we pass a sand sample, which we hope will be representative of a sample collected from a given site, through the bank of sieves, shaking it well until after a given length of time we've affected a given grain size separation.
The sieving made your arms ache. There was nothing really complicated in it because the tutors are very good and lead you through all the stages. So you didn't have to worry too much if you were doing something wrong.
About the same.
Now, we're not working as individuals in this lab. We're working in pairs, and we're working essentially as a team effort, so that once we've got all the results of the lab together, we can start to look at what everybody's done and then begin to piece together eventually a story that will lead us finally to make a reasonable interpretation of how that sand deposit was laid down. I think also, in this particular experiment, we learn an awful lot about experimental error. It is not a precise experiment, and students learn to distinguish between what I would call negligence and error.
So one might hope that this didn't get the fines through, isn't it, with here in this situation.
Yeah.
And you haven't sieved, we haven't got an error because of your sieving or anything. There's no.
It's used the same.
They sieved all the time.
To try and
Oh,
keep
that's good.
continuity.
So when you come up to here, we should
Well,
be
we
able
hope,
to eliminate.
we hope that this is going to come down from the 80s down to about 50.
One of the big things about geology is we're always trying to unravel histories and build up degrees of certainty. And when we look at things that are happening today, a river in action or a coast and waves in action or even the wind blowing in a desert, we can be certain about the process that's happening. As we start to go back millions of years, of course, the whole thing becomes very much more uncertain. And we're talking about vast time scales here, time scales of 100 million years, 1,000 million years, 4,500 million years, right back to the beginning of the Earth's origins itself. And no one can be certain over things like that. We can bring students here to this summer school now, and we can tell them what we believe at the moment to be the best fit idea about a given process. They could come back in 100 years' time, and they could learn something completely different. The field would have moved on. And to my mind, this is probably one of the most exciting things. We can never be totally sure, therefore there's always something new to discover.
Future generations will know much that we are ignorant of. And a time will come when our successors will wonder that we were blind to things so obvious to them. Many discoveries are reserved for ages still to come, when memory of us will have been effaced.
This part of Shap.
And in Bedford we don't have anything like
No, I mean, it's darling Bedfordshire. But,
When you're doing an experiment, it often clicks. You suddenly realise why a certain theory or why this happens or such like, and it's good in that respect.
A holiday? No, I think I'd have chosen Spain. It's not a holiday, it's very much a working thing.
Of necessity, few facts are known to anyone, and for this reason, no one should boast of the many things he knows. For the whole of the learning acquired by a man through 30 or 40 years' heavy labor may be taught adequately to a bright boy in the course of just 1 year. I have proved this in the case of the boy whom I sent to you. In the midst of great poverty and with little previous instruction, he has so widened his knowledge that all who know him are surprised. Although he has learned all he knows by my direction and help, and I have taught him much by written and spoken word, nevertheless, he surpasses me, experienced though I am, in many ways, because he has been given better roots than I, from which he may expect to bring forth flowers and wholesome fruits, which I shall never attain.
On Sunday morning, the Science Foundation course follows Charles Darwin on the round-the-world trip that prompted his ideas on the process of evolution. But from us this morning, that's all from the Open University.